Ray has been actually doing quite a bit of modeling, much of the more traditional modeling involving Markov processes. Today, he's going to talk about, I guess you could say, an extension of that approach, and one that can bring in other information, a Bayesian approach, and potentially could, I think, link some of the work discussed in the previous talks with some of the more traditional methods of modeling. Take it away, Ray.
So thank you for inviting me, and thanks for stopping by. And here are my disclosures. I'll just give you a second to look at those. All right, so this is a brief outline of what I'm going to try to cover in the next 20 minutes or so. And throughout, I'm going to rely on an example using the PATH study youth data, which looks at the association of e-cigarette use and cigarette use longitudinally across the first 3 waves of the data. And the first example that I'll show you is a variation of propensity score analysis to deal with the multitude of covariates assessed at baseline. And then I'll talk about Bayesian networks to illustrate other approaches to data analysis using exactly the same data set. And one advantage of Bayesian networks is structure learning, which means basically learning how the variables are associated with one another. And this should be able to, in theory, tell us something about potential confounding. And I'll end by raising questions, though, about whether identifying potential confounders tells us the whole story that we might want to know. So this is the first study, me along with co-authors. And we utilize something called an entropy balancing approach to handle the multitude of covariates. And this slide shows you the design of the analysis in which we selected tobacco-naive youth at wave 1, so that's the first blue star, and then classified them as exclusive e-cigarette users at wave 2, so that's the next 2 stars on the right of the first blue star, and then looked at past 30-day cigarette smoking outcomes at wave 3, and that's the last 2 blue stars on the right. And for those of you who might know, this is referred to as a new user design in the pharmacoepidemiology literature. One thing I want to call your attention to is look at the small sample sizes, or actually event sizes, on the right-hand side of the slide, and just keep that in mind for future purposes. Okay, so as mentioned, the exposure was e-cigarette use at wave 2. The outcome is past 30-day cigarette smoking at wave 3. And we identified 55 pre-exposure potentially confounding covariates at wave 1, which is baseline. And those are summarized here briefly. I won't go into the details of what they are, but it's all the usual suspects, everything you could dredge up in the PATH data set. And then we used an entropy balancing approach, which essentially is designed to reweight covariates across the exposure groups so that there's covariate balance. It does what conventional propensity score matching does, but it does it in a pre-processing step. So you don't actually have to do matching. And this slide just shows what the balancing does. So it works really, really well. We get complete balance on the all of the 55 covariates or potential confounders. All right, and this is the outcome of the analysis. And here we're looking at the effects of initial e-cigarette exposure on tobacco-naive youth, and then 1 year later, past 30-day cigarette use. And you see that, I'm just reading my notes here. You notice that the odds ratio, where we just do this analysis with sampling weights only, we see an odds ratio, which is the effect of e-cigarette use on subsequent cigarette use, of 5.16. And then when we do the entropy balancing, that odds ratio decreases to 3.67. All right. So this is just a little extra analysis that I won't talk about much, but if you do this study, but instead of looking at who used an e-cigarette at wave 2 and look at who actually used a cigarette, this is the predictive power of initial cigarette use on continued cigarette use one year later. So you see an odds ratio of 47.23, which decreases to 21.98 after entropy balancing. And that just tells us that if somebody starts, a tobacco-naive person starts using a cigarette first, then they're more likely to, report past 30-day use of smoking a year later. Anyway. Okay, so let's move to Bayesian networks. And what I'll show you is a Bayesian network approach to analyze exactly the same data that I showed you, which we did propensity score entropy balancing on. So for those of you who don't know, Bayesian networks, and this is just a hypothetical one, are a graphical representation of a compacted joint probability distribution. And what's shown are probabilistic relationships between the variables. So Bayesian networks consist of nodes, which are the circles, which represent the variables, and arcs, which are also sometimes called edges or arrows. And an arc indicates that a relationship exists between the nodes. There's an association between the nodes. And the absence of an arc implies independence between the variables. And this is, you don't need to, drill into this deeply, but this is a classic kind of Bayesian network example where we're interested in the probability that the sprinkler is on, given that the pavement is slippery. And you can see how you can just factorize the joint probability distribution to give you the answer to that question. So this is, again, just a classic example in the Bayesian network literature, but you can also see how the networks are depicted. So that's the introduction to Bayesian networks, but that's pretty cursory. So this is a pretty deep area. And for that, one needs to rely on, at least I do, software that does the work for you. So I used something called Bayesia Lab to do the analysis. But this is not the only, and this is proprietary software, but it's $700 a year for academics, so it's not terribly priced. But you can do Bayesian network analysis with other free software packages. For example, you can do it in R with packages bnlearn and Shiny BN. All right, one thing about Bayesia Lab that takes us into somewhat different territory in terms of how the work is done is that everything's based on information theory and the concepts of information entropy. So we're working in the metric of bits, essentially. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, the closest analog would be, the log loss statistic, which is what you get out of a logistic regression, essentially, with a binary outcome. Another metric that is available to us and is really the bedrock of the Bayesian network is mutual information, and you can also compute other quantities such as the KL divergence. All right, a huge challenge with Bayesian networks, well, with any modeling really, is that the number of potential networks is super exponential. So here with even 3 nodes, there are 25 possible networks. So if we're going to use tools like Bayesian network modeling to tell us a story, we need to make sure that it's possible to do so in the space of algorithmic complexity. So what Bayesia Lab does is it uses algorithms to learn the network structure. So it searches that exponential space, and it uses score-based algorithms. In this case, the minimum description length score that actually does balance between model complexity and degree of fit of the data based on maximum likelihood estimation. What's also nice about Bayesian networks is that you can encode prior knowledge in the network. You can use prior distributions over the network parameters and so forth. Okay. Now, this is an example of what Bayesia Lab can do. So on the left is the data structure on something called the causal challenge that was issued several years ago. So researchers were sent this data set. They didn't know what the structure was, and they had to use their favorite machine learning techniques to retrieve the structure. So I ran the data through Bayesia Lab, and we retrieve exactly the same structure, which is very reassuring because it tells us that the Bayesian network software is doing its job. All right, so now I'll get to the actual results. This is all a work in progress. Save your slings and arrows and questions for later. So this is a depiction of the data. And again, all the variables are nodes, and wave 1 is all the covariates. At wave 2, we have the exposure variable, and at wave 3, we have the outcome smoking variable. And here is a simple and computationally efficient structural learning algorithm, which is minimum weight spanning tree. And it shows us that exposure and cigarette use are connected, but not directly. There seems to be this variable that connects them, and this thing called gain 2 is actually a variable that measures externalizing behaviors. This just shows you the menu of options that one has to choose from in terms of both unsupervised structural learning and then supervised learning, just to give you a feel for things that you can do. And you can mix and match these learning algorithms and then you can test the model fit to see if in fact you do better. Okay, so this is the results of a semi-supervised learning algorithm, and you can see all the covariates in a jumbled heap, all interconnected on the left. But then we see that there are connections to both e-cigarette exposure and the outcome. Notice though that there's no direct link between exposure and outcome. So we could think about these indirect links as possible confounders. What I did to simplify the approach is what could be called a probabilistic structural equation model. And you'll see that essentially the algorithm clusters the covariates into a set of factors here, eight factors that then are related to the outcomes themselves. And I was able to specify that there is in fact a temporal relationship here. And this is the same set of data, except I reran it now just with the factors, and we see that we now have a direct connection between e-cigarette exposure and cigarette smoking. But notice that the factors themselves are highly intercorrelated. And the factors also have effects on both the e-cigarette exposure and the smoking outcome. So could these be considered as possible confounders? Well, yes. If we in fact look at the definition of confounding, the first one says control for each covariate that is a cause of the exposure or of the outcome or both. And you'll see here that most of the factors are fulfill those criteria for confounding. So we could treat them as confounders, but I hesitate to do that because this Bayesian network is actually probably telling us a more interesting story about possible causes and effects of exposure, e-cigarette use, and smoking. So I haven't delved into the true meaning of all of this yet, but it just raises a caution flag to me that if we're jumping into the world of causal modeling, we shouldn't necessarily jump in with both feet first before taking a closer look. And this is just a model of the overall model fit. And the short story here is that the model does a pretty good job of predicting non-smoking outcomes, but it doesn't do a really good job of predicting smoking, which sounds a little strange, but it's actually true. And if we look at our, mutual information metric, and again, think of this roughly as a correlation, we see that the effects are really small, in terms of shared information here between e-cigarette use and then subsequent smoking. Notice, though, that if we did, and this is on the right part of the slide, if we did a conventional statistical test, it would be highly significant, and you'd be running to JAMA, telling them that they have to publish your paper because this is just like crazy significant. But in fact, the information content is actually very low. And this is just another way of looking at the data. These are it's a tornado plot. So we look and see at the top, there's the effect of the exposure variable, and then, in rank order effects of these other factors on the outcome. But these are all total effects. So one thing we could do that I haven't done yet is actually decompose the indirect effects and all the different pathways, which is something nice that you can do in a Bayesian network analysis that would be very, very hard to do in other types of contexts. And I know I've got about 2 minutes left, so this will be the last slide. So the other thing you can do with Bayesian networks is you can set evidence. So at the top part of the slide, the top panel, you actually see the data as they're observed. So about 4.18% of this, youth population used e-cigarettes at wave 2. And of those, 1.1% actually smoked a cigarette. Remember, I told you this, that the event rates were really, really small at the beginning. So if you look at the next panel, the middle panel, we can actually set the evidence. And here I was able to actually set the evidence so that 100% of the youth used e-cigarettes. And there we see the increase, in smoking go from 1.1% to 4.89%. If we did the opposite and this is the bottom panel, and we set all e-cigarette use to 0%, then it goes from 1.1% to 0.94%. So again, that corresponds to the idea that we can predict non-smoking better than we can smoking. So that's it for me. And I think I'm just about run out of time. So I'll turn it back over to you, Raphael.
Thank you, Ray. This is fascinating and really exciting to see these more, I guess, technical or advanced approaches coming into tobacco, which I think it's something that's sorely needed. There are a couple of questions. Maybe we'll start with one, which is maybe relatively naive, which is like, I guess you were throwing many covariates into the analysis, right? And then this is what you got. So the question is, what if you were to start with a smaller number that isn't, I guess that's what was happening after post-fact, where you were looking at factors. But
no, exactly.
Yeah.
That's why I did the probabilistic structural equation modeling, because the 55 covariates is a lot, and I was looking for a way to simplify those, in terms of do they have some sort of a correlated structure? So then we ended up with 8 variables rather than 55. But you could also do other things where you could say, well, I'm just going to look at things that maybe experts agree on ought to be confounding variables. And this goes back to a talk that was done earlier. I mean, there's lots of ways to approach the covariate question. The propensity score modeling is another way, which is you boil it all down into a single score. And I don't know that any one of these approaches is necessarily best or the right one. I think they all tell us different things.
One thing, and before I forget, I'll mention it, because unfortunately Andy Highland cannot be with us today, but he was, I guess, agreeing with the point of using or relying on path as another data source to inform models. And this is one way that you can maybe extract more information from path than other approaches. Before I give the word to David Abrams, just one quick follow up. This is from Jonathan, who's a doctoral student here in Michigan. He said, did you account for time varying covariates? Like, you have many covariates. Were those changing in time, or they were based at fixed at baseline?
No, they were fixed at baseline, but I could do that. Obviously, it would be a much more complicated model, and that's on the bucket list of things to do. But yeah, it's definitely feasible.
Great.
So Ray,
David,
thank you, Ray, for an excellent talk. I've seen pieces of it before, but not the whole thing together. So I have a bit of an advantage perhaps over other people. But one possible conceptual conclusion, and I understand that this has some of my priors in mind here, but would you say that what you looked at when you described that complex structure of how the e-cig to cigarette relationship was largely not direct, at least not initially, provides pretty strong evidence without an a priori model for what might be called shared vulnerability or other factors that have to do with risk-taking behavior in some way?
Yeah, so there are a lot of indirect effects. And so, again, that's why I'm saying we need to kind of take a step back and understand what those mean. I mean, you can say, well, this is a confounder. Well, but I don't know if that's the right word for a lot of these things. And you notice I didn't do a deep dive into interpreting what it all meant. That's going to take more work. But I think some of this could definitely be compatible with what you're saying, David. And you know, it's not just a simple, you know, we have this association, we controlled for, you know, X zillion covariates, and there's this residual effect, which we therefore call a causal effect. It's much more complex and actually I think much more interesting than that. So again, that's why this is a work in progress to be continued to try to tease apart some of those questions.
A quick related question from my comments. You asked, isn't the Bayesian modeling approach a type of machine learning type approach to pick out the key variables? Would that be your interpretation?
Yeah, yes, it can be used along those lines. So what the machine learning here is finding the structure, in other words, the associations within the variables. And what it'll do is find a structure that's optimized. So you know, in a sense, then when you're looking at the optimized network, you're saying that there are real connections here, there are associations. And what you could do is you could say, well, how does this, whatever the, you know, the machine learning finds, how does that compare to, let's say, other models maybe that other people have found, or other conceptual models? Because you could take the same variables and just rearrange them differently. You can do that in Bayesian networks, and you can then test one model against another in terms of actual fit. So I mean, that's a convoluted answer to your question, but yeah, you can try to get at that to see which one, you know, which variables are playing a role. You know, where are the significant pathways?